Okay. Okay. Today we're going. Oh yes. How does this? Okay, we'll see. Oh, you know what? I did not adjust the display resolution. Let me just sort of thumb ahead just a little bit, see what it looks like. I don't think I have. I have a couple things that are a little small, but they aren't. That's an eye chart anyway, so don't worry about that one. It's more there's some. Okay, the tables look fine. All right, that's the main thing I was concerned about. Okay, so as you know, the way the course is structured, we're trying to present some material in lecture form, and then we wanted to have a class project so you get a chance to actually be able to apply a lot of the material that we've presented. So the class project, how many people here are taking the class for 3 or 4 credits? Okay, all right, so I would say about, what, 4 or 5? And I think we have 8 who are taking it for 3 or 4 credits. Yeah, all right, so, all right, and so for those of you taking the class for 3 or 4 credits, there's a class project. That's what I'm going to go over today in some detail, sort of motivate it and the like. For those of you who are taking the class for 1 to 2 credits, it turns out you're going to play a sort of a reviewer role. So you actually have a homework today that's based on what it is that the people who are taking it for 3 or 4 credits are doing. And we're going to talk about, really, this is the class project is not very deep or extensive in terms of the actual coding. I think you'll find that the coding is relatively modest. It's much more about what we call engineering process. So how do you think about what you're going to build? How do you describe what you're going to build so that other people can then comment on it? And then how do you go through the process of building something and making sure then that you've tested it? So it's not, I don't expect there'll be a lot of code. There's going to be actually probably more to write in English prose than there is, code to write. But that's fine. And for those of you who are taking the class for 1 to 2 credits, there's actually no code for you to write. It's just going to be comments on sort of the process that they're going through. So it's a little bit different, a little bit of a change, but I'm hoping also that some of these process ideas will be sort of instilled and absorbed. Okay, so the way I'm going to do this today is I'm going to do 45 minutes of lecture with interaction as appropriate. I really won't do much of any, I don't think there's any code that I do today, although we'll show some equations. Then we're going to do, Kenneth sent out an email, actually a second email too, sort of restructuring the teams. We had one formulation of it. We did a second one because of adjustments in the class. And so there's going to be team meetings for those people who are going to do the class project. We'll see how that balances out, because not everybody is here who's supposed to be doing the class project, so that's a little bit of a challenge. But the idea is that during these team meetings, you'll get a chance to, first of all, meet your team members. Some of you may never have met before. And secondly, sort of organize yourself a little bit. And the third thing is sort of brainstorm about what you need to do. And the people who are taking the class for 1 or 2 credits, what you'll be doing is you'll be observers, and you'll be able to provide feedback about sort of the process, questions you had. It's really, a lot of this is somewhat subjective, but we'll give you some criteria to work with. Yeah, make sure we got everybody. Okay, and the last part is, in the team meetings, there are going to be 2 teams, and so each team will have a short report. This is not public speaking in any big way. It's not expecting anything definitive. It's more a matter of sort of get your mind going about what you need to do and talk about that a bit. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the class project. So how many people here have done some ecosystem modeling already? Okay. All right, not much. This is not going to be deep stuff. We tried to make the project credible from a biology point of view, but it's not intended to be very deep stuff. It's actually based on a paper written by some people at University of Washington about eelgrass and the importance of eelgrass ecosystems. There's a set of models around this. If you go to the course webpage on the left-hand side, the navigation bar, you'll see something there that says class project. Follow that link and you'll see a 2-page write-up and with some pointers. That gives you more detail. So, I mean, I think people have an intuitive understanding about a weak ecosystem is. You have a set of species who are co-located. There's interdependencies between them. The model that we're going to use for this is relatively simple. It's a predator-prey model. So, you know, who eats whom? That's sort of the extent of the insight here. These are a lot of times much more complicated relationships because there's variations in terms of activity of organisms based on sort of their microclimate, having to do with water, with temperature, and other considerations, and of course life cycle considerations for the organisms themselves. All right, so there's some discussion about the basis for looking at eelgrass, the kinds of things that are important around eelgrass. What is it does? There are many different factors. This is sort of to give you sort of the broader thought. And part of the motivation behind introducing these bigger ideas is that as you look at the project, because the project is about trying to figure out sort of the steady state amount of each organism or each species in the ecosystem, think about the kind of ways this information could be used. It might be used as it relates to, for example, preserving an area for recreational purposes by limiting erosion. So you want to stabilize eelgrass in particular. It might be because of certain species that you're interested in. And you look at the food chain, and you're talking about a predator, maybe an owl, that you're interested in, and that predator may eat another predator like a snake, which may eat something else, which ultimately feeds on eelgrass. And so eelgrass may be an important part of this. So there are many different policy and sort of economic reasons, the objectives you might have when you think about how you're going to try and stabilize an ecosystem. And at the root of all this is a model of that ecosystem. If you change something, how does that affect the sort of the size of the size of each one of the species that constitutes that ecosystem? All right, so let's talk a little bit about this, how we're going to do the model. Again, this is relatively simple, and I certainly do not claim to be an expert. Anybody who has taken a class or actually worked with a PI who does this kind of modeling, you may actually have some other insights you would like to contribute about the limits of this. Okay, so we're going to do what I'm going to call steady state modeling. And then steady state is sort of a strange term for an ecosystem because obviously there are dynamics which vary with time. So the idea is that conceptually you sort of reach within some variability level. Sort of the number of members of the species will remain stationary. And actually, we're interested in a couple things. It's not just members, number of members of the species. It's also their size. And the way this model works is it combines both of these concepts together into something called biomass, which is the total mass of members of that species. So you basically get, sum up the weights, of all members of the species. And that's what it is we're trying to estimate, is the biomass of each species in the ecosystem. And so, as we talked before, you can use this for a lot of things. I mean, you can do this for academic purposes, policy purposes, and then also if you're looking at, for example, effects of global climate change. You may be introducing in variations in the ecosystem. Wow, eelgrass is going to really decline. What does that mean in terms of the rest of the food chain? So that's sort of motivation behind it. Okay, so the next step, I'm going to get into some more detail. How many people here, everybody here has taken physics? This is really just more of an experience with, have you had some experience with building mathematical models? Because, if you're doing something computationally, chances are you're doing something with numbers. It's not always true, and there's a lot of computation that goes on that is not numeric. But chances are you're doing something in the sciences with numbers. So this whole notion about constructing a model is really crucial. So let's talk a little bit about what are the factors that you think are going to affect steady state biomass. Okay, so actually I'll go back here a little bit. I gave you sort of a flash of that, but that's okay. Give me a few things. If you're talking about some sort of, let's say, a marine environment, you have grass, you have fish, you have birds that are eating the fish, you have bacteria, plankton, a whole bunch of things are going on there. What is it that you think will affect, for example, the population the total mass of each element of the species? What are the things that you would look for if you wanted to try and construct this kind of model? Okay, so reproduction rate, that's a really good one. Okay, and what else would you look at? Yeah. Available food, that's a very good one. Okay, and along with available food, so available food is sort of like who eats whom. Right, and how much of that whom there is available, that certainly makes a difference. What else, what other part about that? Now there's another sort of aspect of that, which is related to the organism. For example, to survive, it needs so many calories or a certain distribution of nutrients. So in addition to the available food, there's also what? How much it needs to eat. Okay, so we've actually got 3 parameters already. That's excellent. Other things that you can think of? And that's actually really good. I mean, I think this model has like 5 parameters, 5, 6. So you've got a lot of them already. Okay, so one thing is ecosystem is not necessarily totally closed. So there's immigration into the ecosystem, and and then there's emigration out of the ecosystem. And you could be human harvesting, for example, where we're taking fish or deer or something. So that's actually very good. You have a lot of intuition there, and you've got a lot of this already. So the biomass is what it is that we're trying to estimate. This production ratio is really about reproduction. This is how much you're eating. That's the consumption relative to your mass. So, I mean, typically we expect you'd have to eat enough to sustain your mass. You may actually have to eat more than that. So this diet thing is more complicated. This is the who eats whom. Right? And so what it's done is it's done in terms of fraction of the mass of other members of the ecosystem. So DJI, so I is going to be the species that we're looking at. So like B sub I, going back here, B sub I is the biomass of species I, for example, an owl or a fish. This is the reproduction, essentially. How much more does it produce than its actual mass? And that's, again, subscripted with I and the I down here as well. When we get into the diet one, it has 2 subscripts, I and J. And that's because for some species, let's say an owl, it's going to eat a certain amount of other species. So we need to talk about both of them, and that's why you have both the I and the J. Yes?
What if I eats more than just one species? Do you have to have
Yeah, exactly. So that's a good point. So it is, and this could be that I does eat more than one species, absolutely. And then what it is that for if you fix I and you sum across all J's, this should sum to 1. So it's the fraction of its diet that comes from many different sources. Right, exactly. Okay, and then we've got what comes in additions to the ecosystem, that's the A sub I, and then what gets removed from it, that's the R sub I. Okay, so that's really the entire model. Okay, so now we sort of see how these parameters fit together. I haven't shown you what the actual equation is for computing things yet, but when you're talking about the project is about constructing a system that does this kind of modeling. That's what the project is about. So we talked about what the parameters are, and by the way, you're not restricted. If you come up with something better than this or an alternative to this, that's great. You just have to show documentation if you want to solve a different model. That's fine. But the starting point is you've got to have an ecosystem that you're going to model. For this project, and this is part of the sort of science side and the real world part, is we don't give you the ecosystem. I mean, we give you pointers to some literature that you might look at, but you're going to have to figure out an ecosystem, and it's not something that has to be scientifically correct or validated, but it should be credible. You should be able to come up with sort of a credible argument about who eats whom in what sort of restricted setting, and be able to come up with parameters around that. So you're going to select your ecosystem. Here's a simple one I picked out. The main reason why I picked this one out is because I want you to have at least 5 species. And this graphic was readily available, and it's okay. I probably could sort of spin a yarn around why this was credible. So we've gotten the owl is eating a snake, and the snake eats a bird. The bird eats a grasshopper. The grasshopper eats a plant. Okay, so that would be an example of this. and it's relatively simple in terms of the predator-prey relationships. Okay, so that's step one. You pick an ecosystem, and by the way, you're more than welcome to take this and say your justification is you talked about it in class. If you also add in maybe a little bit more about why that might be a credible ecosystem, if you want to start there. Okay, then you want to find the parameters. Okay, so remember we've got all these parameters here. So we've got, here are species, and then we've got to find all these parameters. The reproduction, the food consumption, the amount that comes, that gets removed, the amount that gets added to the ecosystem. So you've got to figure that stuff out. Now, I came up with numbers that were, not very well justified, really. There is an article that is referenced in the class project that gives parameters by species. And I think that you could go through that and say, well, wow, I'm gonna have bird in mind, and an example of a bird is a gull. And I see another bird over here, which is another kind of bird, and they seem to have similar parameters. Or I'm going to take the mean of those two. I mean, that would be a credible way of justifying your parameters. Okay, so here are the parameters I came up with, and I'm not justifying these, just that they were within the ranges that were presented there. And I'm doing this as really a numeric example so that you can go through and you see precisely the computation that you have to do. But I would want you to probably spend a few sentences talking about why you chose the particular parameters that you did. So just to make sure we're clear here about what's going on, if we look at okay, my pointer does show. Okay, so let's look at this. This says that for an owl, it's reproducing the mass, the biomass. It's actually not even reproducing its whole biomass in a period of a year. Just 3/10 of its biomass in a year. So what you hope is that if that's the case, well, wow, it better not die too fast, otherwise it goes extinct. Okay. It's eating a lot. It's eating 40 times its biomass. So there's a lot of food that's going on there. Okay, and then these parameters over here I chose somewhat arbitrarily. So 5 of units here, let's call them kilograms, for lack of a better term. Maybe they're tens of kilograms. It gets removed each year, and 3 is getting added. But then if you go down here, you see very different numbers. And these are numbers were taken from the charts you'll find in the reference in the notes for the class project. A snake is reproducing very rapidly, and whereas the bird is not, and the grasshopper is a bit more. So anyway, there's wide variation here. The other thing that you'll find about this kind of model is look at the last row down there. Look at plant. Okay, so why is it that we don't see anything for that second column, the Q over B column for plant, in this ecosystem? Speak up, please. It's not consuming biomass of the ecosystem. Now, obviously, that's not really true. I mean, there's stuff that is going on, but it's a model. Right, it's a model. And you will find that. You will find parts of your model where, there are zeros you have to put in, and that's the justification you have. It's not consuming mass from the ecosystem. All right? Okay, now the diet fraction one, this other parameter, DC, that is a tricky one. It's a more complicated one because you've got the interactions between them. In that sense, it's a little more complicated because now it's not just, a column. You need a table because you need this relationship between I and J. But we know a lot about that, don't we? Actually, in this ecosystem, it's pretty easy to figure that out. Okay? So why is it that owl has zeros? So owl is the first row over here. This is the I. So this is the fraction of owl's diet that it consumes. And we see, well, owl's not a cannibal. So owl's not eating owl. All right? Owl's eating snake, but not bird, grass, or plant. Right? And that's exactly what's going on in this chart over here. It's a graph. Each element of the species eats only one other type at all. And down here for plant, we see what? Exactly for the reason he just explained. That the plant is not consuming any biomass within the ecosystem. Okay? Right, so that's the setup, and actually there's a certain amount of your time, for the project, which is really just about finding the parameters and justifying them. And that's sort of the reality of any kind of modeling effort, is that you need to do that. You need to figure out parameters and be able to justify them. Here is the model, that equation up there. And let's go through that for a second, because I've given you sort of the setup for it, but we haven't talked about the explanation. See if this all makes sense. So what this is saying that if you take any I, like let's say owl, that you're talking about, there's steady state means that the amount of mass, the biomass, is equalized. So you've got the amount of mass that gets produced in a year. These are annual numbers. Okay, so this is the ratio of mass to what it produces times its biomass. So that basically would be the total biomass that gets produced in a year. That's that first term. And then you have to take out everything that eats that species, eats that I. Okay, that's why it's Dij. It's what is that we're summing across all j's that are going to eat this I. And then over here, we've got the amount that gets removed, like from harvesting, and then A is the amount that gets added. And we're saying that should be the same, that we basically, whatever we add, we're also removing so that the number doesn't change. Okay. Does that make sense so far? Okay. All right, so now let's solve for biomass. All right, so that's what we're showing. We have parameters for each one. We have values for each one of these parameters in this particular example. The amount produced, the P over B, the Q over B, the R, and the A. And we know the DCs. The DCs are really simple, for each one of them because of this relationship in the ecosystem between the species. All right, so let's start out over here and start solving. Okay, we're going to start out by just writing one equation for each species. Okay, so let's start out with owl. Okay, so all we're doing is we're interpreting this right here in terms of the parameters that we have available to us. Okay, so owl is 1, index of 1, so I equals 1 for owl. Okay, so B1, and B1 is an unknown. That's what we're solving for. We have to multiply it by its production. That's P over B. Well, we've got that from the chart right there. That's 0.3. Okay, why is the second term 0? Nothing's eating owl, exactly. And the third term, why are we subtracting the 5? Right, that's the R sub I. The R sub 1 is 5, and the A sub 1 is 3. Okay? And you can do the same thing all the way down here. Now here it gets a little bit different. Okay, so 2 is a snake. Okay, so but for 2, we see that we are subtracting out the biomass of B1 times 40. Why are we doing that? And where do we get those numbers? What term in this equation does this B140 correspond to? It's the subtraction up here. And why is it that we're subtracting out B1 times 40? It's the biomass of the owl, because owl eats snake, and then it is the amount of that it eats, the ratio of its consumption to its biomass. So that's this term right over here, this Q over B. But it's the Q over B for owl, right? Because it's what owl is eating. Owl is eating snake. Okay, and then we've got the -2 and 5, which correspond to these columns over here. And so on down. We have each one of these equations in turn. And as before with plant, it becomes very simple because, well, we've got a bunch of zeros down there, and so that's less of a problem. But let's see, I'm losing my pointer here. Okay, but we do see for plant we have a B4 times 15. What's B4? Biomass of grasshopper. And why? Where do we get the 15? Exactly. From the grasshoppers Q and B. Okay. All right. So at this point, once you can get to this point, so you've gotten your parameters, you've been able to interpret your this general equation in terms of individual equations, at this point, it's pretty much stuff you've already seen before in terms of solving a matrix equation. And so I go through that. I give you some details on that. We're going to go from this set of linear equations. You've got a system of linear equations. We can put that into a matrix form. And so that's all I've got over here, where the columns correspond to B1 through B5. Over here, these are intended to be, it's supposed to be a matrix over here. This table is a matrix. And so you're doing regular matrix multiplication. So this is B1 times 0.3. And then, yeah, okay, and then what I did over here, which may be a little bit confusing, is I added up these two terms over here, the -5 and the 3. So you come up with a -2, if that makes sense, because I combined those together. So it's not a 1, yeah, I didn't do it as a 1-to-1. Hopefully that wasn't too confusing, okay? Then over here, this 3 here, do you see where the 3 came from? The second equation, look at the two terms that do not have a b on them, add those together, you get 3. So that's where it came from. Everything else is just really those same equations in a matrix form. Right? So now we have a matrix equation, and we can do the usual thing of doing a solution. Right? Just take the inverse. Okay? Right? This makes sense so far? Okay, so we're going to start with, you're going to do the model, which is, picking your ecosystem. You come up with parameters. I give you a pointer to a paper that has lots of tables. And so you can choose, species that look close to the ones you've selected for your ecosystem. And then you're going to set things up in this kind of form here and solve this equation. And, we have stuff that does this. And so you come up with answers like this for the biomasses. So once you see something like this, I mean, this is great, to do this kind of model and be able to sort of put it together and have it look, sort of credible for this kind of form is good. The next thing you'd like to do is you'd like to be able to ask and answer some science questions. So, I mean, one of the things is if you look at these numbers, you see, wow, owls at the top of the food chain and plants at the bottom of the food chain. But it's sort of interesting the way the biomasses go. It's not like it's linearly increasing, right? Which is sort of curious. I mean, it's not like I have, a ton of plant and then, much less of grasshopper. I actually have less plant than grasshopper. Sort of interesting, at least for this solution. I don't know. And so one of the questions you ask, and this is really a question that sort of combines your science and your model, is you ask some questions about this. Well, how can so little plant support so much grasshopper? Why is that the case? And so it ultimately, I mean, and when you do this with actual science, you'll find that part of the problem may be that the biomasses from your model, it's possible that they don't correspond very well to what you actually observed in the field. And so you're doing two things. One of them is you're trying to figure out what's wrong with your model. And when your model is right, you're probably also trying to figure out, well, why does this ecosystem work that way? So for the purposes of this, since we don't have a real ecosystem to compare measurements to, let's just assume that the model is correct, or at least interpret this in the context of the model and be able to ask that. And let's try and answer that question. How can so little plant support so much grasshopper? And to answer that, what we have to do is we have to go back, we have to do two things in combination. We have to remember what it is that we're looking at for our model, because that's really the basis for these relationships, okay? So we've got the amount that's being produced here, that's a key parameter, sort of the productivity of that species, how much it eats, and then we've got things that leave and things that arrive. Things that leave and arrive don't play a huge role in this, so it's going to be more this QB and PB. So let's look at the plant grasshopper issue. Okay, oops, I'm going the wrong way. Go back to plant and grasshopper. Okay, here we go, plant and grasshopper. Okay, so we're interested, how can so little plant support so much grasshopper? So if you look at this and you see what it is that is going on here, how can so little plant support so much grasshopper? Any thoughts about why? Well, it's reproduction of what? The plant, exactly. Look at that. It's reproducing, 24 times its biomass each year. You don't need a lot of plant there and to be able to consume that. And so grasshopper doesn't produce so much. I mean, so it's only 3 times, and so it can consume a lot of plant. Now, grasshopper does require a lot of plant, like 15 times its biomass, but plant is reproducing, 15 times or 24 times its biomass. So that's the way it works out. That's why it works out. Again, this is a model. I don't know what the reality is, but this is what you would do in terms of an analysis if you came back and said, wow, I looked at the actual numbers for, the ecosystem, and when I look at it, I see that actually I have 400 units for plant, not 263. So why is that? Well, then you would probably go back and say, well, is plant really as productive as I thought it was? Is it really 24 times? And that's the way you work with it. So you just both do it to interpret and also to debug. Okay, all right. And there are other questions too. He asks a similar thing like why snake has such a small biomass, given the large bird biomass. In other words, it would seem like, wow, look, there's so many birds out there. Couldn't snake, the population just really expand tremendously? And what do you think the kind of answer is that you're going to be looking for?
Snakes being eaten by owls.
So that's one thing, snakes being eaten by owls. That's a really good one. What else would you look for? Maybe snake has to eat a lot of bird in order just to survive. And so, yeah, you need a lot of birds out there. So those are the kinds of things you're looking for to try and interpret the models. Okay, so talked a little bit about attaining the parameters. What we're looking for is at least 5 species and some sort of credible predator-prey relationship. If you have plant-eating owl, that's not credible. So, but that's the level of sophistication you're looking for. Just have something that looks sort of reasonable. Again, not and ideally some citation. All right. All right, so then the other parameters. So those are the other parameters you're looking for. Got an article in the class project. You can go on the internet. So right, everything on the internet is believable, right? So hey, you can go there. It's something, and then or the other thing is something is just a credible argument. And again, it's a layman's argument. We're not talking about something that is necessarily biologically correct. Okay. So now I'm going to get more onto some details about the first part of what you're going to do for the class project. And that's the functional specification. So you know what the system is about right now, at least in an intuitive way. You're going to provide these models. It's some sort of, in order to do this, your user has to interact with your system. You're going to have to build something. You have to get these parameters and all that sort of stuff. But your user is going to interact with your system and is going to ask questions like, what is the steady state biomass for the ecosystem here? Okay, fine. You've given me that. Well, you may ask other questions too. And you're going to have to decide what questions you're going to allow. That's part of the project. Can someone ask the question, why is snake biomass so small? I mean, that might be a question you would ask too. So you have to figure out what it is you want your system to do. That's the functional specification. And then also, it's 2 parts. What the system does, and how it is that the user interacts with the system to get that question answered. And what does that mean? What do they get back? Do they get back a number? Get back a table? Do they get back a plot? What does that mean? That's what the functional specification is about. Okay, so here are the 3 things you're looking for. The user profile. Why would we include a user profile in a functional specification? What are we interested in there? Why would you do that? Yes?
It's useful to know who your audience is.
Exactly. It's useful to know who your audience is, much like when you write a paper. If I'm writing to a 6th grade audience, I'm going to write it differently than I'm writing it to graduate students. I'm going to assume different knowledge, right? So if my user population are people who only know about spreadsheets, have never programmed, then that's going to be very different from people who are very sophisticated MATLAB users or Python users. For Python users, I might just give them a Python package and say, do a pip install. if they only know about spreadsheets, I probably am going to have a program that they can, maybe is just available from a standard repository. Maybe it's already even pre-installed in their system. So it's a very different way of doing it. The use cases, who remembers what a use case is? Yes.
What the thing is used for.
Exactly what I said. It's not a trick question. A use case is what the system is used for, such as figuring out steady state biomass. Okay, so that, and the details of the interactions are about how can someone who has that user profile, the user profile you talk about, you get to choose what the user profile is, but that user profile do the things that you say they're going to do in the use case. How can they do that in a way that makes sense? How do they interact? What do they have to put in what way? Is it through a file? Is it, a command line argument? Is it something that, there's an input at one point? How are they going to do it? And what do they get out? Do they get a plot? Do they get a file? Do they get bells ringing? Is it in Morse code? I mean, how is it they're going to get it out? And that's for you to specify, and that's what the functional specification is about. So user profile, these types of things, you can think about, I'll tell you in the industry, people can go sort of crazy about user profiles, and there'll be pages and pages and pages. Something that makes sense that is, like on the order of like maybe a paragraph, enough so that it's clear what it is that the person can tolerate. If they know about spreadsheets, maybe some of the output is in the form of a CSV file that gets read in the spreadsheet, for example. Okay, so use cases, certainly you want to find steady state biomass. It may be, for example, you want to be able to update the parameters of the model. Maybe, that's a use case you'd like to have. There may be others too. But I'd say you want a couple of use cases. And then the details of the interactions. And in the lecture on design, went through this in some detail, gave some examples of this. We have not talked at all about graphical user interfaces, really, from the point of how you build them. So it's expected that you're doing this with command line tools. And so you're assuming a user population that's comfortable with entering in something in a command line. I'm assuming that. But they can enter in information on the command line. They can enter in information. You could have some of the information in a CSV file. We talked about how to read CSV files. It could be through prompts, input, outputs. There could be a lot of different possibilities. Okay, so the homework for this, there are two parts for this. So if you're taking the class for 3 to 4 credits, and now let me see the count of people taking the class for 3 to 4 credits. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Great. 7 out of the 8. Excellent. Okay, so if you're taking the class for 3 to 4 credits, what you're going to do is we're going to have a short team meeting in just a minute, and what you're going to do is you're ultimately going to be responsible here for you're going to set up a team repo. You're going to have a functional spec, which I gave you the outline. It's the user profile, the use cases, and then the descriptions of the inputs and outputs. So that's what your functional specification is about. And then you also want to be able to do the thing about figuring out what it is you're going to initially model to instantiate this. You may provide some flexibility, let someone model their own ecosystem, but you have to provide one as well. So what ecosystem and what parameters? And that that's all a little bit of a write-up that you have there, and that should be posted in your team repo. Okay, and what are the other people doing? So we have a lot of people. How many people are taking the class 1 to 2 credits? Okay, all right. Actually, it's only a couple more than the other ones. All right, great. So what you're going to be doing is your job is essentially to be reviewers. Now, you should pick one of the teams to sort of listen in on, and your job there is you're going to be passive. Let them organize because they've got enough to do just to organize. But I want you to make sort of your own comments. It's not a critique of what they're doing, more a matter of your insights about what's going on and what you think that if you were in their shoes, what might you do a little bit differently? Okay, so it's more to engage you in the process without having you have the the demands of going through the full project. All right, so team meeting times. Here are the teams. So who's on team 1? Who's here? 1, 2, 3. Okay, so that's this group of 3, and then team 2? Okay, great, great. So why don't we do this? Why don't we, I'm trying to think about how, with this room, what would be a good way to organize. We could do opposite sides, and then we're going to have some people, other people sort of hanging out around them. What do you think? Is that, seem reasonable? Okay, all right, so, I don't know, team 1, team 2? Okay, does that make sense? So team 2 to my right, team 1 to my left. And then if you're in the 1-2 group, then why don't you sort of hang out nearby and sort of listen in on what's going on? And then we're going to reconvene in 20 minutes. So at 12.
So we just write it on a piece of paper?
Yeah, just write on a piece of paper. I mean, you will submit something as, this will be your homework, homework 15. Right, and you'll take notes now and you'll submit it as a doc. And yeah, just a text file.
Oh.
Just text file, right?
Not docx.
It doesn't have to be docx. No. It can be just a. I'm sorry.
Can it be a doc file then?
If you want.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I have word processor.
Okay. All right. All right. So, all right. Good. So the other thing for the teams, there's just one other thing I want to make sure we're clear about for your agenda for your meeting. Okay. There's a lot of logistics you should probably just do right away. Make sure you have one another's names and emails, contact info, okay? Figure out where your next meeting is. That may sound silly, but that's probably one of the most important things so you can keep on, your connection. In a little bit after noon, somebody in your team is going to give a short summary of what happened, okay? Figure out who that's going to be. All right, so that's the first few minutes of your meeting. And then go through and talk about use cases and the other stuff, okay? I'll leave this up here so you can look at it.
Analyzing the ecosystem of the marine ecosystem of sharks to tuna to shrimp to dinoflagellates and then to diatoms, and we are trying to appeal to the high school. Is that one high school kid who knows terminal at every high school?
Okay, cool. Excellent.
Is there anything else?
Okay, so how are you going to get the, that's very good. Have you thought much about how you're going to communicate with them? Whether are they going to type on the terminal, or are they going to?
We have not discussed that far in depth, but since this one kid knows terminal, maybe he will
be able to
do that.
All right, that sounds good. And have you thought about how you can get the parameters of the ecosystem? So you know your ecosystem, that's a great start. And then you've got to figure out, the production of biomass and the consumption and stuff like that.
Yeah, we've thought about how since we're doing the marine ecosystem and how fish and sharks migrate a lot, it'll be a little difficult to get the actual parameters, but we're probably not going to make it that detailed.
Right.
If that's okay.
Well, you could also say it's in an aquarium.
Okay.
Right. So and the high school students are coming into the aquarium.
Okay, I like
anyway,
that.
So you got just something that makes sense. It's the experience of trying to justify why the parameters are there instead of just picking numbers out of the air.
Yeah.
But not saying that they're scientifically credible. Not claiming credibility on the science side. Just justify. Okay, excellent. That sounds very good. Before you step down, any questions from either the people who are observing or others about this?
Don't do this to me.
but these are intended to be constructive questions. It's understood. I mean, keep in mind you only had 25 minutes.
Yeah.
Right. So this is.
Oh, great.
Oh, okay.
Yes, you in the back there.
How do I use terminal?
Oh gosh.
Is it a purely like a chain, a food chain?
Yeah.
It's not like the shark eats everything, or is it?
No, it is a food chain. We chose specific species that would just eat each other so that they don't affect other species rates.
All right. Any other questions? Okay, and the people who are taking, who is in Team 1 who is taking the class for 1 to 2 credits? Okay, and so you've gotten notes down that you'll be able to do your homework based on what you've observed. Okay? Something like that. All right, fine. It's also your personal experience with, observing a team. Okay, very good. Why don't we do
the business development group? Is that what you're trying
Yeah,
to say?
right.
They're our advertisement.
management training?
Yeah.
Okay.
We're the
uh,
grant committee. We're trying to see what else.
Yeah, right. Executive committee. There you go. Okay, team 2. Okay. Okay, great.
So,
Oh, please stand over here so we can record you. Yeah, right.
okay,
Just be
alright.
careful.
We're gonna put this on YouTube later.
Yeah, right.
Oh, now I'm so nervous and scared.
Yeah, you
so-
do have a cat with you, don't you, or something you can show for YouTube?
I'm sorry, I've disappointed everyone on YouTube. So I'm part of Team 2, and we haven't quite decided on an ecosystem. We talked more about what the code will do and kind of fit that into a user case, but basically we were thinking terminal, call for the function through Python, or sorry, so you basically type in Python and then the function or the file name, and it'll be a little more interactive where you type, put in a CSV file. You're given directions when you call for this function on how to format the CSV file, but basically you'll put in the header and then all the parameters for solving for biomass through what we went over in class. And then the output would be with one file, one graph and a table, possibly. The graph will be a bar graph where the y-axis is biomass, x being the organisms, and the table being basically what we saw in class, the organisms and then the biomass values. And then in the we were looking at the rubric for the syllabus for the specific to the assignment. We saw that you want to know how changing values for a particular species, the parameters for the species changes the biomass. And so we were thinking the user can put in another file, same species, same format, and it'll do kind of like a comparison and spit out the original graph and table, but except the table will have another value, which is the newer value, and then it'll also do a subplot and spit out a new graph, doing a line plot. It'll be a line graph looking at the changes in each of the organisms' biomass. So that's what we were talking about.
Oh, that's very good. It's very interesting, these groups, very different focus. And I would say that, if I was going to use industrial analogs, this is definitely the marketing group. You knew who your customer was. You wanted to sell something. This is definitely engineers who want to know, what can I build? So, it's wonderful. And both you can come at problems from either direction. And so this is excellent. One thing you might want to think a little bit more about who your user is. It's, just to sort of think through the entire process. There is no right way to do this. You can either start as an engineer and build stuff bottom up, or you can start as a marketeer and build stuff top down. And both of them are perfectly valid, but at the end, you should have both pieces. Okay,
So
very good.
You guys will need to do a little bit more engineering in here. You guys will need to do a little bit more.
Okay,
Yeah,
that sounds good. Excellent. But before you step down, just 1 second. You get to be in the hot seat for just a second.
No. Well, if
Right.
I'm up here, then the rest of the team has also.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
sure,
Right.
like-
It's not just you by yourself. You have a team. Okay. So, any questions or comments? Okay. Yes, please.
I know you didn't really talk about what group you want to do, but are you going to think about doing like a food web instead of a food chain?
Our team has yet to decide on that. I guess that'll be the next thing we talked about.
Okay. And that's fine. This was intentionally a very short meeting, really more to just get you engaged with some group interactions. And it was expected also by having it so short. I was setting our expectations and yours very low, right? So that's fine. So that's great. It just have more of a sense of what you need to do. Okay, and both teams have then exchanged information, contact information, and have you also set up a date time you're going to meet next? or at least a plan for how you're going to do there? Get there.
Someone will be sending.
Somebody
out
will be
mass
okay. That's called a plan for a plan.
text.
Okay. All right.
And this is due next Wednesday?
Yeah. So next Wednesday you have the functional spec, and then also the parameters, the ecosystem and the parameters. Both of those are just write-ups in some format. You could do it in a doc format. That probably would be very convenient, or Google Docs, either one. And it should be in a repro. Okay. Very good. Thank you.
Friday we're going to do the same thing, but for the design document. So it's really important that everybody show up for that because we need to hate and bail on Friday. So please come on Friday.
Okay. Yes, in the back. I'm sorry. What was this about?
Yeah, text file.
Yeah, text file. Right. Okay. All right. Great. Okay. See you on Friday.
So this would be a good thing to start at the beginning of the course, just like talking, like getting